On a stormy winter night, a homeless man named James Miller was arrested for breaking into a diner, not to steal, but to seek shelter from the freezing cold. A former Marine, once decorated for bravery, now forgotten by the very country he had sworn to protect. His arrest made no headlines. To the world, he was just another vagrant. But inside that courtroom, when he stood silently before the judge, something unexpected happened. A voice from the past spoke up, a stranger who wasn't really a stranger. And what followed left the entire courtroom speechless. This is not just the story of a trial. It's the story of redemption, sacrifice, and a truth that had been buried for decades. Snow drifted in slow, silent sheets over downtown Chicago, covering the cracked sidewalks and neon-lit alleys in a deceptive layer of peace. James Miller stood motionless on the corner of 8th and Franklin, his breath forming shallow clouds in the frigid night air. His military-issued coat, worn thin with time and soaked from the melting snow, offered little warmth. The bitter wind sliced through his clothes and skin, reminding him of the desert nights in Afghanistan, but this was a different kind of cold. This was the cold of abandonment. He hadn't eaten in 2 days. His fingers, raw and trembling, clutched a torn canvas bag containing everything he owned. The buzz of the city barely registered. People passed him by without a glance, businessmen, couples, tourists, none of them seeing the soldier who once stood tall in uniform, medals gleaming under a sun-soaked flag. Now, James was invisible. A ghost of a man the country forgot. As he walked past a warmly lit diner, the scent of grilled meat and hot coffee hit him like a wave of memory, his mother's kitchen, laughter with old comrades, moments that now felt like fiction. His stomach twisted in hunger, and his feet, almost without permission, carried him to the door. He hesitated, glancing at his reflection in the glass, unkempt beard, sunken cheeks, eyes dim with exhaustion. Still, he pushed the door open. Inside, warmth enveloped him. The hiss of the fryer, the clink of silverware, the hum of conversation, it was another world. He slipped into a booth in the corner, keeping his head down. He didn't want trouble. He didn't want pity. He just needed a moment to feel human again. But kindness didn't come. Within minutes, a waitress whispered to the manager, who then made a quiet call. James knew the drill. A few minutes later, the bell above the door rang again, this time for 2 officers in navy blue. One of them asked him to stand. The other glanced at the manager, who nodded silently. James didn't resist. He simply rose to his feet, shoulders slumped not from defiance but from weariness. "I wasn't stealing anything," he said quietly. "Just needed to warm up." They handcuffed him anyway. To the customers, he was just another vagrant causing a scene. But to James, it felt like the final betrayal. Not from the diner. Not from the police. But from the country he had once fought to protect, a country that seemed to forget him the moment the war ended. The metal cuffs pressed against James' skin, cold and unforgiving, as the police officers pushed him into the back of the squad car. He barely registered the words they were muttering to each other, something about a disgruntled veteran and another case of PTSD. But it wasn't their words that haunted him, it was the cold, oppressive silence that surrounded him, suffocating him more than the handcuffs ever could. The hum of the engine blended with the harsh, rhythmic thumping of his pulse, a steady reminder of how far he'd fallen. He sat there in the back seat, staring blankly ahead, but his thoughts were far away, trapped in a loop of past battles and distant memories that felt more vivid than anything in his present life. The flicker of gunfire, the smell of smoke in the air, and the desperate cries of men who had once been his brothers echoed in his mind. And then, the silence. The haunting silence of the world he'd left behind, where no one understood the battle that raged inside him. James had always believed in the mission, once. He had fought for something greater than himself, for the idea of service, of duty. But now, it felt like a cruel joke, a facade that had been stripped away the moment he stepped back onto American soil. The pride he had felt when he wore the uniform had been replaced by a suffocating bitterness that twisted his insides. He had returned a shell of the man he once was. He had seen things, done things, that had marked him in ways that no one could see. And now, all he had left was this, handcuffed in the back of a police car, with no one to trust, no one to talk to. The car came to a stop, jerking him out of his thoughts. He barely reacted as they yanked him out of the vehicle, dragging him across the cold concrete like a common criminal. The bitter winter air bit at his skin as they pushed him toward the station, their hands firm on his shoulders, guiding him like a broken man who was no longer in control of his own steps. Once inside the station, the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, sterile and unfeeling. The harsh brightness only amplified the deep sense of disorientation that was consuming him. He was here again, another arrest, another night spent locked in a cold, impersonal cell. He had been in this position before, more times than he cared to admit, but this time felt different. This time, he wasn't just fighting against the system, he was fighting against himself. The anger that had been buried deep within him for so long now surged to the surface, a dangerous fire that threatened to consume him. He was shoved into a holding cell, the heavy door slamming shut behind him with a finality that echoed in his chest. He sank onto the hard bench, the chill of the concrete seeping through his thin clothes. The cell was small, confining, and the walls seemed to close in on him with every passing second. He couldn't breathe. The air felt thick, suffocating, as if the weight of his past mistakes and regrets was pressing down on him, crushing him from all sides. James closed his eyes, trying to block out the walls that felt like they were closing in. He took a deep breath, but it did nothing to calm the storm inside him. His mind raced, flashes of his time in the war, the things he had seen, the things he had done. The faces of the men who had died beside him, their voices still lingering in his ears. He had carried their ghosts with him for years, each one a silent accusation, a reminder of the blood on his hands. But the worst part was the silence that followed them, the feeling of being invisible, as if he no longer mattered to anyone. His heart began to pound, the pressure in his chest building until it felt like it would explode. He stood up abruptly, pacing the small cell, his fists clenched at his sides. His body felt like a powder keg ready to explode, but no matter how much he moved, he couldn't outrun the thoughts that plagued him. The guilt. The anger. The shame. But then, a sudden stillness washed over him, like a quiet whisper in the back of his mind. He thought of her, his daughter, the one he had never met. The one he had promised to protect but never could. The thought of her brought with it a wave of sorrow, a pang of regret so deep it nearly broke him. But it also stirred something else, a flicker of resolve, a flicker of hope. Maybe it was time to stop running. To stop being the man who was haunted by his past. Maybe, just maybe, it was time to find redemption. The weight of the decision settled heavily on his shoulders, but for the first time in years, it didn't feel like a burden. It felt like a purpose that had eluded him for far too long. James knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be no quick fixes, no simple answers. But he was done with being invisible. He was done with being a ghost in his own life. It was time to fight, for himself, for his daughter, for the life he had left to reclaim. The hours in the cell stretched endlessly, each second more agonizing than the last. James leaned against the cold concrete wall, his back stiff, his muscles aching from the uncomfortable position. The monotony of the sterile environment, the flickering lights overhead, the endless hum of the ventilation system, seemed to drown out everything else. But it didn't drown out his thoughts. His thoughts were loud. They echoed in his head, relentless and sharp. His mind was a battlefield, torn between the desire for revenge and the need for redemption. He could still picture her face, the soft, innocent features of his daughter, the one he'd never truly known, but who was so deeply entwined in every fiber of his being. His chest tightened at the thought of her, his breath catching. The memory of her was both a comfort and a torment. He had missed her first steps, her first words, the moments that had belonged to another man, the man who had raised her in his absence. He had failed her, but he wasn't going to make that mistake again. He wasn't going to let the sins of his past ruin the only chance he had left. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him, a heavy burden that he couldn't shake. His hand clenched into a fist at his side, the muscles in his arm coiling with frustration. And then, like a spark in the dark, the name Walter Green flared up in his mind. The man who had taken everything from him. The man who had kept his daughter hidden away, brainwashed, and manipulated her into believing that the man who had fathered her was a stranger. The bile rose in James' throat as he thought about it. The anger was hot, raw, and consuming. He was no longer the soldier he once was, the man who followed orders and sacrificed everything for a cause that now seemed distant and irrelevant. No, now he had a personal war to fight. A war for his daughter. A war for the truth. And Walter Green was his enemy. The door to the cell swung open suddenly, breaking his spiraling thoughts. James' heart skipped a beat, his pulse quickening. For a moment, he didn't know whether to feel relieved or terrified. A guard stood in the doorway, impassive, almost as if he had no idea of the storm that was building inside James. Without a word, the guard motioned for him to follow, and James moved on instinct, his body responding faster than his mind. The guard's steps were steady, but James' mind was racing. He wasn't sure what awaited him. Perhaps it was another interrogation, another round of questioning that would lead nowhere. Perhaps it was something worse. But as they walked down the narrow hallway, the dull sound of their footsteps reverberating off the walls, he couldn't shake the sense that this was it. This was the moment. This was the opportunity he'd been waiting for. The door at the end of the hallway creaked open, and James was ushered into an interrogation room. The room was cold, stark, just a table, a pair of chairs, and harsh fluorescent lights above that cast an almost clinical glow on everything. It felt like a place meant for secrets, for confessions that would never see the light of day. The door slammed shut behind him, and for a second, the sound echoed in his ears, amplifying the stillness that surrounded him. Then, the footsteps came again. Slow. Measured. A man entered the room, older than James had expected, with sharp, calculating eyes that seemed to size him up instantly. There was something unnervingly calm about him, a stillness that belied the danger James had felt in his gut the moment he'd walked in. His eyes flickered to James for just a moment, then settled elsewhere, as if James were already beneath his notice. James didn't need to be told who he was. The man was unmistakable. Walter Green, James said, his voice low, almost a growl. His heart pounded in his chest, the fury building within him like a storm that had been gathering for years. I knew it would be you. You're the one who took my daughter from me. Walter's lips curled into a small, condescending smile. He didn't seem at all fazed by the accusation, as though it were a common occurrence for him. Ah, James Miller. How predictable. I thought we'd run into each other eventually, but I must admit, you've made quite an entrance. James' hands clenched into fists at his sides, his nails digging into his palms as the anger surged through him. He wanted to leap across the table and throttle the man, to make him feel the years of pain and loss that James had endured. But he didn't. He kept his composure. He had learned how to control his anger once, and he needed to do it again. There was too much at stake now. I don't care about your games, Green, James spat, his voice cutting through the air like a blade. You lied to her. You made her believe you were her father. You isolated her from the truth. His voice broke for a brief second, the weight of his words sinking in. You took her life from me. Walter's eyes narrowed, his smirk fading, replaced by something colder, more calculating. You've misunderstood, Miller. What I did to protect her. To give her the life she deserves. He gestured vaguely toward James, his tone mocking, you were the one who failed her. The one who wasn't there when she needed you most. James felt the words like a physical blow. He wanted to retaliate, to scream at him that it wasn't his fault, that it wasn't too late. But the words stuck in his throat. Instead, he leaned forward, his voice steady but filled with an undeniable edge. You don't get to play the hero here. You don't get to hide behind your twisted version of what's right. I'm here for my daughter. And I will get her back. Walter straightened up, his expression no longer dismissive, but rather one of cold assessment. You're a fool, Miller. You don't know the first thing about what you're up against. The system, the law, none of it matters in this game. You're not going to win. I'm not playing your game, James retorted, his jaw clenched tight. I'm going to make sure she's safe. And that's the only thing that matters. You've lost already, Green. You just don't know it yet. The silence between them was thick, suffocating. For a moment, neither man moved. But James felt something shift in the air, a tension that had been building between them, palpable and undeniable. Walter's face tightened, his eyes flickering with something that almost resembled fear, but he quickly masked it with a sneer. You're right about one thing, Miller, Walter said quietly, his voice low and threatening. This is far from over. James didn't flinch. He was done waiting. The time for talking was over. He'd made his choice, and he wouldn't stop until it was done. He was going to take back everything that had been stolen from him. James remained frozen in his seat, his mind swirling with disbelief, anger, and something darker, a sense of urgency that was slowly consuming him. His heart was pounding in his chest, and for a moment, he wondered if he had truly understood the gravity of the situation. Was it all just a nightmare? Or was the harsh reality of his daughter's abduction finally sinking in, threatening to crush him under the weight of it all? The door behind him creaked open, pulling him out of his spiraling thoughts. But it wasn't a guard this time, it was her. Grace. His ex-wife. The woman who had once been his partner, his closest confidant, now a stranger to him in many ways. Her presence in the room felt like a storm cloud descending on the already suffocating tension. It had been years since they had spoken beyond the occasional awkward exchange about their daughter, but here she was, standing in front of him again. Her eyes met his, and for a brief, fleeting moment, James saw the woman he had once loved. But that was before the fracture, before everything had fallen apart. They had drifted so far apart over the years, their marriage torn apart by guilt, resentment, and the weight of loss. Yet now, despite the bitterness that had defined their interactions for so long, she was here. For their daughter. For what remained of their family. James, Grace's voice broke through the stillness, her tone soft, but there was an undercurrent of something stronger than fear. It was determination. She was here to fight. We need to talk. James shifted in his chair, his body taut, every muscle alert, his hands gripping the armrests so tightly his knuckles were white. The familiar rush of adrenaline flooded his veins, pushing him to his feet. There was no time for niceties, no room for lingering doubts. His mind was focused solely on one thing now, saving his daughter. Walter Green, the man who had manipulated and twisted everything to his advantage, was watching the exchange with a smug, almost amused expression. His presence in the room only fueled James's desire to tear him apart, but he held himself in check. He couldn't afford to lose control, not yet. Not when they were so close to the truth. Grace walked closer to him, her footsteps tentative, but there was something resolute in the way she carried herself. She had always been the stronger of the two of them, the one with the steady hand when everything else seemed to crumble. Now, more than ever, James needed her. They were in this together, whether they liked it or not. "We don't have much time, James," she said, her eyes never leaving his. "The longer we stay here, the harder it's going to be to get her back. Walter has control over her, and the longer we wait, the more entrenched it becomes. We can't afford to waste any more time." James's chest tightened at her words, a knot of fear wrapping around his heart. The thought of his daughter, trapped in that man's twisted world, made him feel sick. He wanted to lash out, to break something, to scream, but he forced himself to stay calm. His mind, though frantic, was sharp. He turned toward Walter, his jaw clenched. "I don't care what you think you've built here." James's voice was low, steady, but with an edge that cut through the room. "You've crossed a line. And I'm not going to let you get away with it. We're taking her back, Walter." Walter's lips curled into a sneer, a laugh escaping his throat. It was cold, cruel, the kind of laugh that sent chills down James's spine. But he refused to be intimidated. "You think you can just walk in here and take her from me? You're nothing, Miller. You're weak. I've already won. You don't have the strength to break me." James stood tall, his body rigid, every ounce of focus trained on the man who had taken his daughter. "I'm not the man I used to be," he said, the words coming out in a quiet but forceful growl. "I'm not the same man who walked away from his family. I'm not weak, and I won't stop until I have her back." For a moment, James felt a flicker of doubt. Could he really do this? Was he truly strong enough to face off against a man like Walter? But then he remembered the face of his daughter, the image of her terrified eyes, her mind twisted and broken by Walter's lies. That was all the strength he needed. Grace stepped forward, her hand lightly resting on James's arm, grounding him, reminding him that he wasn't alone in this fight. "We'll do this together, James," she said, her voice soft but resolute. "We're not giving up. Not now. Not ever." The words hit him like a wave, crashing over the doubts that had been creeping in, drowning them out. Together. They had always been stronger together, even when it seemed impossible. Walter shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his eyes narrowing as he looked between them. The cocky smirk was gone, replaced with something far more dangerous, a flicker of uncertainty. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected James and Grace to come together again, to find a common purpose. And that fear, that vulnerability, was all James needed to see. "Do your worst," Walter spat, his voice dripping with contempt. "You'll never win. She's already mine." But James knew better. He wasn't going to let Walter win. Not now. Not ever. And this time, he wouldn't be walking away. The promise to his daughter burned in his chest, a fire that would never be extinguished until she was safe. "Let's finish this," James said, his voice steady and full of conviction. Grace nodded, her eyes meeting his with the same resolve. Together, they would fight until the end. The air in the room felt heavy, charged with unspoken emotions. James and Grace stood side by side, their bodies tense but resolute, locked in a quiet moment of shared understanding. The silence stretched between them, punctuated only by the distant hum of an old clock ticking slowly in the corner. Every second felt like a reminder of how much time had been stolen from them, of how long they had been searching, waiting, hoping. But now, this moment, the moment they would confront Walter Green, was all that mattered. James could feel the tightness in his chest, the knot of fear that had been gnawing at him for days. Fear for his daughter, who had been trapped in this nightmare for so long. But deeper than that was a simmering anger, a fury that threatened to boil over at any second. Walter had taken his little girl, manipulated her, filled her head with lies. And now, this man, this broken soul, thought he could hold on to her forever. James clenched his fists, the urge to do something, anything, to break Walter's hold over their daughter almost overwhelming. He wanted to storm in, to drag her out of that hellhole without a second thought. But he knew better. They had to be methodical, careful. The stakes were too high. They couldn't afford to lose control. Not when everything they cared about was on the line. Beside him, Grace stood like a rock. He could feel her presence, solid, unwavering. In many ways, it was her strength that had kept him going all these years. She had always been the one who saw the path forward when all he saw was darkness. But now, her face was etched with a quiet determination that matched his own. Her eyes, once filled with sadness, were now aflame with purpose. She was not just his partner in this fight, she was the heart that would keep them both moving, even when everything around them threatened to break apart. "Are you ready?" James asked, his voice low, betraying the uncertainty that lingered just beneath the surface. Grace met his gaze with a steady look, her lips set in a firm line. "I've never been more ready in my life," she said, her voice steady but full of an intensity that sent a shiver down his spine. "We're bringing her home, James. No matter what it takes." Her words gave him a sense of calm, but it didn't last long. The door in front of them loomed large, like a threshold to a world they had been forced to enter. The room beyond it was filled with their worst fears, with the twisted man who had held their daughter captive for so long. But James felt a surge of resolve building in him. He was done being passive. This wasn't just about getting their daughter back. It was about ending this nightmare once and for all. Suddenly, the door creaked open, and Walter Green's voice rang out, laced with contempt. "You think you can just waltz in here and take her from me?" His tone was sharp, almost mocking, but there was an undercurrent of nervousness that James could feel. The man was losing control, and he could sense it. "I'm not taking anything from you," Grace replied, her voice cutting through the tension. "I'm taking her back. You've had your time. Now it's over." James could feel the heat of his anger rising at the sound of Walter's voice. His hands tightened into fists, his nails digging into his palms. He had thought about this moment for so long, the confrontation that would free his daughter. But now that it was here, the intensity of the situation hit him all at once. It wasn't just about getting her back, it was about confronting the man who had stolen her life from them. Walter took a step closer, his face contorted in a sneer. "You really think you can just walk away with her? I've spent years building her up, making her believe in me. She's mine now. She'll never see you the way she used to." Grace's eyes narrowed, her posture shifting ever so slightly as she squared her shoulders. The fire that had ignited in her only moments before now burned brighter. "You've twisted her, manipulated her. But you haven't broken her. And you're wrong. You don't get to decide what she believes." James could hear the quiet force in her words. Grace wasn't just talking about their daughter, she was talking about herself. About the life they had lost. About the years of pain and the constant wondering if they would ever see their daughter again. And now, with every word she spoke, he could feel the weight of it all shifting in their favor. Walter's sneer faltered, a flicker of doubt crossing his features. He had been so sure, so confident that he had won. But James could see that the walls were crumbling. He could see the fear in Walter's eyes, even if he refused to admit it. This man had underestimated the power of a parent's love. "You don't know her anymore," Walter hissed, his voice rising in desperation. "You'll never understand what we've built together. You can't just rip that away." But James didn't flinch. He didn't need to understand. He didn't need to know how far Walter had gone to warp their daughter's perception of reality. All he needed to know was that he was her father. And that, more than anything else, was what mattered now. James stepped forward, closing the distance between them. "You're right about one thing," he said, his voice low and firm. "We don't know her anymore. But we will. We'll remind her of who she really is, who we really are. And we'll show her that love, real love, can never be destroyed." There was a beat of silence, the tension thick in the air as they both stood there, facing the man who had taken so much from them. And for the first time, James felt the weight of everything they had endured begin to lift. They were done being victims. They were done being helpless. Now, they would take back what was theirs. As he turned to Grace, she gave him a small, determined smile. They didn't need to say anything else. They both knew what had to be done. They had already made the decision. Together, they stepped into the unknown, ready to face whatever came next. And for the first time in a long time, James felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years: hope. James Miller walked into court as a forgotten veteran, broken, silent, and alone. But he walked out not only a free man, but a hero once again. His story is a reminder that behind every worn face on the street, there may lie a past full of courage and sacrifice. It challenges us to look closer, to care deeper, and to remember that true honor never fades. If this story moved you, don't keep it to yourself. Share it, because somewhere out there, another James is still waiting to be seen, heard, and remembered. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay tuned for more untold stories that deserve to be heard.